I'm giving a bad week to European space efforts after the first attempt from Continental Europe to launch an orbital rocket failed.
Oh, no.
The rocket in question is called Spectrum, and it's an orbital rocket from the German startup Isar Aerospace. Now, it did manage to take off, but then it quickly nosedived back to Earth 30 seconds later into the sea with quite an extraordinary explosion. I actually recommend you look it up on YouTube and watch the video because it's really quite spectacular with this beautiful Norwegian glaciers in the background.
Sounds like there's a political metaphor in here somewhere.
Yeah, there definitely is, but I haven't got there yet. The launch was a test launch, and yeah, it took place in the north of Norway on the island of Andøya.
Okay, so it crashed.
Yes.
Doesn't sound like a roaring success. But it was described as a test launch, right? Like, was it ever expected to get all the way into orbiting the Earth?
Yeah, well, the private company who organized this launch, they're called Isar Aerospace, they really don't see this launch as a failure. At least they are framing it in that way in their statements. Daniel Metzler, the CEO and co-founder of the company, said in a press release, "Our first test flight met all our expectations and was a great success. We had a clean takeoff, 30 seconds of flight, and we were also able to validate our flight termination system." And now, I don't think this is like a Trumpy-ish making something bad sound good. I believe it's not merely post-crash spin. Also because he said things before the launch, suggesting that he didn't expect the launch to get all the way into orbit. Metzler was actually quoted as saying last week, "Frankly, I'd be happy if we just fly 30 seconds." And they did that.
Okay.
So, yeah, maybe it's not such a bad week.
I mean, this is maybe a silly question, but like, what is an orbital rocket actually for? Like, what's the point of it?
I think that's not a silly question. I think that's probably a question that lots of our listeners have as well. An orbital rocket is the kind of rocket that would launch a load such as a satellite into orbit or beyond Earth's orbit. The rocket they launched or attempted to launch is a two-stage Spectrum rocket that has the capacity of carrying up to 1,000 kilograms to low Earth orbit. And now the thing that made this failed rocket launch really newsworthy is, as I already mentioned, that it was the first attempt to launch a satellite rocket from continental Europe. Now, I should mention that there was an attempt from the UK by Richard Branson's company, Virgin Orbit, a few years ago. That also failed, and incidentally, the company has since folded. But that UK launch was very different to this one. That one used a repurposed Boeing 747 plane to try and get satellites into orbit, whereas this launch was like more of a vertical rocket launch, I guess what you'd expect when you hear about a rocket going into space. And yeah, this rocket launch also ended in a crash, but there are signs that Isar Aerospace are pretty happy with the test launch. And I felt more and more as I was researching this that actually I shouldn't have really given them bad week, seeing as they see it as a success. I actually think we probably should have done it the other way around, that you gave Marine Le Pen bad week and I gave Isar Aerospace a kind of goodish week.
That makes so much more sense. Why didn't we do that?
I know.
Reverse.
I don't know. But I mean, one of the other reasons why it's not such a bad week is because it's being seen by many in the industry as a real step forward for Europe's commercial space industry. It's worth noting that according to Metzler, no startup has ever launched a rocket into orbit on their first attempt. So, yeah, maybe this is that very rare beast of a bad week story that's actually secretly a good week story.
We got things so the wrong way around this week. Never mind, moving on. You said this is the first attempt at an orbital rocket launch from continental Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, how do we normally get satellites into space, Europe? Like, are we entirely dependent on satellites managed by other countries?
Good question. And yeah, that's a timely question because we're all hearing about the need for Europe to have more autonomy and less dependence on other countries, particularly the US at the moment, especially when it comes to defense. And yeah, there's a big push from within the EU and more broadly in Europe for autonomy in space and in our access to space. the European Union actually now has a new commissioner for defense and space, which I guess makes a lot of sense because a lot of spacey policies have something to do with defense and security. But this new commissioner title, defense and space, really shows that the EU are taking the issue of space very seriously. But to answer the first part of your question, the European Space Agency does already have its own capacities to launch orbital rockets and get satellites up there floating around our planet. But they do it not from continental Europe. They do it mainly on French Guiana in the northeast of South America. So it's, the location of the launch site that was so novel. But actually, now we're talking about this, maybe it's worth talking about the fact that until the middle of last year, there was what some in the space business were referring to as a launcher crisis, whereby Europe temporarily didn't have access to any heavy or medium lift launchers of their own. I won't go into the nitty-gritty, but one of the three main reasons was that Europe had been using a Russian rocket for certain medium-weight payloads, which they stopped using for obvious war-related reasons. That launcher crisis is now over, partly because Europe's new rocket, Ariane 6, had its first successful launch last summer. But it really did wake Europe up to the need to have more options and more secure options when it comes to access to space. During that crisis, Europe actually had to depend on Elon Musk's SpaceX company for some of their launches. And as many politicians in Europe have now realized, being dependent on Elon Musk's whims is not always a comfortable or secure position to be in.
Yes, I had noticed. So even though this launch was done by a German startup, like a private company, you could see this test launch as part of this broader attempt to improve Europe's access to space then.
Yeah, definitely. And many key players in Europe have been talking big about wanting the private sector to get more involved than they have been in the space industry. The commercialization of space is actually currently one of the European Space Agency's strategic priorities. They hope that Europe can become a hub for space innovation with the help of entrepreneurs and lots of private money, because this is all going to cost a lot of money if Europe is going to become more independent when it comes to access to space. The ESA actually also interestingly claim that this strategy will help Europe achieve its green goals, which I kind of, when I read it, I was like, oh, this is a bit counterintuitive, all that rocket fuel that's involved in these launches.
Right.
But maybe they have some of a point that space technologies and satellites in particular are needed when it comes to monitoring the state of our planet and do have a role in monitoring climate change.
The ESA do loads of that stuff, right? If you go on their website, there's loads of climate monitoring stuff you can find.
Yeah.
But I think the environmental debate around space and whether it is good or bad, we could probably make an entire podcast episode about that.
Yeah, I agree. So I will move on from that for now, and we'll come back to it another time. But before I wrap up, I wanted to reflect on the fact that it is quite impressive that this weekend's launch was organized by a German startup that only launched in 2018. Like, this turbo-boosted ascent of Isar Aerospace within the space industry is by no means the only entrepreneurial success story in Europe. There are now a number of significant space startups in Europe, and there are now also various launch sites in Europe. There's this one in Norway, which was used for last weekend's attempt. And there's one in Sweden, which is a former Arctic research base that's been converted to launch rockets. And there's also a launch site on the most southerly of the Shetland Islands, north of Scotland. Some say that Europe's private space industry is lagging behind the US. We don't have any big names like SpaceX or Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin. But some are hailing the launch of this rocket in Norway as a sign that Europe is finally starting to catch up, even though the rocket failed. And whilst I'm here talking about space, I also just wanted to very quickly mention some other European space news that came in this week.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Go for it. We can't get enough space news.
It's also not really bad week. It's actually also good week.
Should we just start again?
Maybe we should. Too late. Yeah, I also wanted to quickly talk about Europe's big Mars exploration mission, ExoMars, which is run by the European Space Agency. That was one of the space missions that suffered because of Europe's break with Russia after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started in 2022. But actually this week, there was news that the Mars mission is getting a new lease of life and that the ESA will be collaborating with the UK on this mission. Russia are kicked out, the UK have joined.
Nice.
I guess it's another sign of the strengthening relations between the EU and the UK. The UK Space Agency will be building the Mars mission's lander, which is the spacecraft that will land on the surface of Mars. And it will be built at the Airbus factory in Stevenage, lovely old Stevenage, north of London.
Nice to see a bit of post-Brexit cooperation with our British friends. What does the EU actually want to achieve with this Mars mission? Like, what's the point of it?
They hope to answer that question that David Bowie so beautifully sung all those years ago. Is there life on Mars? Or more accurately, they're actually trying to ask, like, was there ever life on Mars? And if it all works out, the mission, the European rover will dig 2 meters below the planet's surface, something that has never been done. And they then hope to retrieve samples that are over 4 billion years old.
That's pretty cool.
It is pretty cool, isn't it? Anyway, that was apparently bad week. Bad-ish week. Not a very bad week.
Should we talk a bit more next week before allocating these stories?
Yeah, maybe. Okay, deal.